some of the reasons behind this. When we think about gender stereotypes, we think about how men are supposed to be manly, masculine. They're not supposed to show emotion. They're not supposed to cry. They're not supposed to go over to their friend's house and have a pint of Ben and Jerry's and talk about their problems, right? That's not masculine. So we have a lot of men who are feeling like in order to be a masculine human being, in order to fit into that gender stereotype, that they're not allowed to talk about their feelings. They're not allowed to go to a counselor. They're supposed to be the breadwinner in the family, right? They're supposed to bring home the bacon kind of scenario, and that's a lot of pressure. So a lot of these men, in our area particularly, we see this happening with farmers. Farmers who, working class white men who are dealing with serious economic problems and don't know where to turn to, and are having very, very high rates of mental health instability. Well, this stems from gender stereotypes. Gender stereotypes don't just hurt women. I mean, we know the gender stereotypes. As a woman, if I, am maybe showing a bit of anger or emotion, I'm labeled as emotionally unstable. We've heard all of this, but also gender stereotypes affect men. Feminists want to dismantle these stereotypes. Want to get rid of the idea that in order to be a man, you have to have this certain persona of not being able to talk and express yourself. So how feminism is defined is crucial, really crucial to whether or not people advocate for feminism. And what I mean by this, many people who claim that they're not a feminist have a very narrow definition of what it means to be a feminist. Traditionally, this is the notion that feminism equals women's rights. Feminism is women wanting to be equal to men. That's not, of course that is a huge part of that. Yes, we have to recognize that, but it's not all of what feminism is. Feminism is so much deeper. There's such a deeper level to it. So what I always tell people is, when I approach feminism, when I look at any type of issue, whether that's economic, political, social, environmental, whatever you want to, whatever that is, my starting point, the standpoint that I have to take, or the concern the approach that I have to take, has to start with the most disfranchised group. Now, disfranchised meaning people who are denied the rights and privileges of X, right? It has to start at that point. I don't want to say, the bottom point, because it's putting in your head that those people are at the bottom level or whatever. But typically when we think about individuals or groups of people who have experienced the most marginalization, disfranchisement, again, whether politically, economically, socially, environmentally, we have to look at women of color, right? I don't know what just happened, but women of color. So our starting point when we approach anything, when we're trying to find a solution or talk about theories, whatever, we have to start at that standpoint. And therefore, hopefully, every identity will be taken into account from that point. Harder than it sounds, quite frankly. Okay, so moving forward, a brief history of U.S. feminisms. Oh, there's so much information, I can't get to it all, but our beautiful book will help us to dive in a little bit deeper into the history of feminism. The actual etymology of the term feminist comes from, it was coined in 1837 by French sociologist, philosopher Charles Fourier. So that was the first mention of the term feministe. It wasn't in widespread use here in the US and pretty much around Europe until about 1910. So keep in mind, women in, for example, New York State were granted suffrage in 1917. So sometimes you'll hear me use the term proto-feminist. It's just kind of meaning, the women who came before that period of feministe. So, historical context of U.S. feminisms. Within feminist theory literature, we have this idea of the wave metaphor. So there were different periods, different waves of feminism and feminists, right? It's been problematic, and some feminists have said we need to just get rid of this wave method altogether. I'm going to continue talking about this, and I will talk about why some women and men, and whomever want to get rid of this. But I do think that it kind of gives us a general knowledge about the time period and certain feminists operating in certain moments of history, right? We have to recognize 19th century feminism, of course, is going to be very different from today. So the first wave is the suffrage movement. So this is 1848. Actually happened not too far from here, Seneca Falls, Women's Rights Convention. Women in particular, I don't think there were any men at the first meeting. I know Frederick Douglass did come to one of the earlier meetings, but advocating for suffrage, meaning women's right to vote. Now, what's really important here to understand is the focus was on white, heterosexual, upper middle class women, right? If you were a person of color, if you were even a poor white immigrant woman, typically your concerns were not at the forefront of this movement. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton have been heavily criticized for being very racist, which is very true in many regards. But with that being said, we should not discount what they have done for us today as a woman being able to vote, right? What I do tell people, though, we do have to realize that alongside the Susan B. Anthony, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we had wonderful people like Ida B. Wells, we had Sojourner Truth, we had Sarah Willamette Hua, which I know I'm mispronouncing her name, so Native American suffrage leaders, African American women fighting for women's rights at the same time. And our book actually does a great job representing women from all different experiences. So then we have the second wave, 1960s to the 70s, right? This was a fight for greater access to employment. So this was, they were most interested in challenging gender roles within the workplace and reproductive rights. So here we have the Betty Friedan's calling for greater reproductive rights for women. Again, this is where this wave has been criticized for being about white, upper middle class women. We do see working class women starting to be included in the discourse of the conversation. But here is where we have a really big splinter effect or split within feminism, where we have, in particular, Black lesbian feminists who are saying, wait a second, your feminist concerns, they're not going to help me at all. And we have groups like the Combahee River Collective coming at the fore, saying we need to spend more time on X and stuff. And this is where I should get into saying, and I had mentioned it earlier, there's not one feminism. There are many feminisms. So, for example, I in particular am really interested in feminism and religion. Some women are very interested in class issues with the environment, reproductive rights, body politic, whatever it may be. So there are all these different branches. So remember that tree, all these different branches of feminism. So some feminists identify as socialist feminists, some identify as radical feminists, some identify as spiritual feminists, some identify as transnational feminists, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Because there are many aspects of being a human being. I'm not just a woman. I grew up in a very poor family. I have all of these experiences that help affect or guide what it is that I want to look at when I'm dealing with feminism. So this is where we really start to see a split in different feminisms, where we have Black lesbian feminism coming in, we have Chicana feminism, Native American feminism, all these beautiful movements. I said, hey, what about this issue? You know? Then we have the third wave feminism. And this is like 1990s. We don't really have an end date because some people argue, a certain date, and we don't need to focus attention on that. This is where we have intersectionality, which we'll get more into on another class. We have LGBTQ plus feminism really happening, ecofeminism, critiques of universal health care. This is where we have feminists who are coming in and focusing on sexuality and gender identity, where we have feminists coming up with the idea, well, not coming up, but really expounding upon the idea that sex is different from gender. If you're interested in this, Judith Butler, she's a pioneer feminist working within that framework. So there's been a huge backlash against this wave analogy, and we need to get rid of it right away because it's a very white Eurocentric viewpoint. And I do agree with this to a certain degree, this notion that feminism just sprang forth with a bunch of white women in New York and England. Very problematic, right? I mentioned it day one. Feminism has always been around. Since women have existed, feminism has existed, right? They've always fought patriarchal oppression since the beginning of humanity. And there's a history full of women warriors and women of color, and women of color suffragists, women's rights movement happening all over the world, fighting for what we know as feminism. That is actually why the main reason why I chose Maggie Kendall's graphic novel that we're using. Oftentimes we see these infinite versions of the history of white feminism, right? But people who do not fit into that dominant white feminist narrative have a difficult time finding representation of themselves. And this course in particular really seeks to recognize those contributions too. So when we're talking about Susan B. Anthony, absolutely recognize the contributions that she gave to the suffrage movement. But alongside that, talking about Sojourner Truth and other women of color and men of color who fought very hard alongside them, white suffragists, to gain suffrage. And while we have to note of her racism, we can't deny the fact that Susan B. Anthony heavily contributed, obviously, to the 19th Amendment. The problem is when we're only talking about that one narrative, that one particular brand of feminism, meaning white